So, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a local thing. That's in Cleveland. It isn't really all that far away. I visited it. Potentially you visited it. Do you know about this Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? As a place that's filled with stuff, it's a fun museum to visit. Expensive, but fun. I've been there. It's been a long time since I've been there. But I like the sort of talking pieces, discussion starters, or I'm interested in some of the stuff that they have in the building. But that isn't the totality of what the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is. It's not the Rock and Roll Museum. It's the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And when it gets down to the Hall of Fame part, away from the museum part, this starts to get kind of strange. I don't know if you've ever thought about the induction process, who gets in or who doesn't, but it's always pretty strange, and I don't know if I ever can make any sense of it. Just in the last couple of weeks, we heard of this year's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame class, right? You hopefully by now know that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is local. Potentially you've gone to the museum. Did you hear about this year's class? Just to tell you about how arbitrary this process is, I have two groups. I had two groups that I was interested in, that I like, that were into the finalists, that were getting voted on and would potentially be able to be into the Hall of Fame this year. Actually I had 3 or 4, but I have 2 that I really like. And one got in and one didn't. And if you made me guess, hey, one of these is going to get in and one isn't, I would have guessed it would be flipped around from the way it was. So the whole process is just sort of random. I don't know how you feel about that. Did you see this year's inductees? One of them is a person that I don't really know anything about. Her name is Kate Bush. She is included in this year's list of inductees. And the only thing that I know about Kate Bush is that she is a musician who has recently had a former #1 song go to #1 again, decades after the first time it went to #1. I do not remember it from the first time, even though I was alive, but it has gone back to #1 again, mostly because of it being on the internet and being used in a Netflix series called Stranger Things. And it was located there again for the first time and renewed and went right back to #1. I had actually heard a couple of years back a remake of this, and that was the way I knew that song. The song is called Running Up That Hill, A Deal with God. And I can't say this is my favorite song ever, but it's by Kate Bush. It was #1 decades ago. It was #1 again in the last few years. And so maybe you know it. Running Up That Hill, A Deal with God by Kate Bush, who is now Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee Kate Bush, for whatever that's worth. And there's some of these lyrics inside of that song that of course get my attention. I'm a person whose whole, career for sure, and a lot of my life is built around faith and theology and who God is and how God works. And so I, of course, get my interest piqued by music that has God in it or has lyrics about that. And this song is called Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush, A Deal with God, which I am not going to sing because it would ruin it for everybody, including Kate Bush herself. She would instantly be uninducted if I sang it. But the lyric is, and if I only could, I'd make a deal with God, I'd get him to swap our places. And if I only could, I'd make a deal with God, and I'd get him to swap our places. That's part of Running Up That Hill by Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee Kate Bush. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to Preparing for Sunday, where you and I together take a look at the upcoming Sunday's scripture lectionary text. This is for Sunday, May 14th, which isn't just a significant day on the church calendar, it's also a day in the cultural calendar. This is Mother's Day, and I'm going to make a separate video this week that is a Mother's Day tribute and in memory of Martha Osgood. I'm going to link those two things and make that video, so that'll be available to you if you want to look for it. But this is Preparing for Sunday for May 14th, It is Mother's Day, but I'm thinking more of how it is also the 6th Sunday of the season of Easter. And you'll remember in this season of Easter, I am sticking with, I guess, lectionary be damned, sticking with Luke chapter 24, the story of the road to Emmaus. And so here I am preparing for Sunday again, talking about this same text with you, another angle of the same thing. If you piece the last few of these together, you can get all sorts of angles about the road to Emmaus. So here I am sitting with it again, and I'll start to enter into the text itself today by talking to you, with you, about a thing that I have mentioned before but haven't mentioned for a few weeks now, which has to do with sort of narrative criticism of the Bible. Scholars approach the Bible with a handful of different tools in their toolbox. A lot of these approaches are called criticism. There is like form criticism. There is text criticism. There's form would tell you a certain way to read the scripture. Text criticism will tell you some background of how it came to us. Usually scholars are sort of experts in one of those fields and apply them to the scripture that they're reading as the tool through which they read. You can Google all these things if you want to learn more about them. I tend to lean towards a sort of branch of biblical reading that's called narrative criticism. And of course I would like that. I read a lot. I like to think about how stories are structured, why a certain character shows up in a story the way they do, when they do. It sort of breaks down the almost like English class way of reading a book, the characters, the locations, the way a book is written. And this would be called narrative criticism. And so one of the things to think about as a narrative criticist, person who leans towards that, is the characters. The characters in the story of the road to Emmaus. The characters are, of course, Jesus, Simon, and the other disciples appear. But I would say in this story, some of the primary characters, the women who go to the tomb appear. But the primary characters are Cleopas, he's named, that disciple walking along the road, who's walking along with another disciple. Jesus himself is a character in this, but Cleopas, I would say, is probably the main character. Which character in this story do you identify with? Which one, while you're reading the story, does your heart and soul sort of swap out places with? Which one of these, if you were to say, this is a story where God speaks to me, which character would you slot yourself in as in the position of hearing or experiencing God or the story the way that character does? That's a narrative criticism way to approach the text. I would say that we are sort of invited with this text to see ourselves as Cleopas and the other disciple walking on this road. Are we running from Jerusalem because we've been scared? I don't know. Are we going to Emmaus because we're going back home? Are we going to Emmaus to go back to our everyday lives, or maybe we're going there to proclaim the story of Jesus crucified and risen? These are what you do when you put yourself in the footpath of the characters in the story. If we're Cleopas, and I think that's who we're meant to be in this story, how could Jesus appear to us, talk to us, and then us maybe not even really know we've been entertaining an angel unaware? How can we see ourselves as the Cleopas person in the story? Can we swap out places Kate Bush style with them? And it's one thing to ask that question in terms of narrative criticism. For the Bible to be a narrative criticism, it's asking where that story becomes part of my story. How, when I look at the story, when I break it down, when I think critically of the story and its narrative and insert myself into it, how does that fit into my own life? Where have I been on a walk where I've been like Cleopas? Maybe running from Jerusalem because I'm scared. Or maybe on a hike from point A to point B, or in the middle of a project from point A to point B. And where in the midst of that has God shown up, and maybe I didn't realize it? Maybe I tried to give a bunch of data and background and open up the scriptures, and Jesus himself is who's talking to me. The question here is, can as easy as it is to see myself as a character in this story, the Bible always asks us to do that, to see ourselves Usually I see myself as the disciples in the story, who are gathered around and taught by Jesus, or who see the miracle and don't understand it, or often that's who I see myself as. I sometimes force myself to be the Pharisee, the guy who thinks he knows everything but doesn't. I never really see myself as Jesus. I think that's God working, and I don't want to identify with that because God is different than me. But here I am, and the people who I think I swap myself out with, the characters, are probably Cleopas in this story. And then that begs a question of me. Is it actually possible to make a deal with God, to swap out our places? Is it actually possible to walk a mile in someone else's shoes? The character Cleopas is a character, is this narrative, storytelling character. And so I can swap out places with Cleopas. But what about in real life? Is it really possible to walk a mile in someone else's shoes? Besides narrative criticism, one of the things that am most interested in and that informs me is a thing called family systems theory, which you could Google. This is a way of seeing the world, and a lot of the way I see the world draws from this. And it has two limiting, what it calls equators, two things that people try to do that are actually not helpful. Family systems is a very complex thing. I'm not going into that in this video. I've already gone into narrative criticism a little bit, and you would have to Google that if that piques your interest. Family systems is something I talk about or from this place of often. A lot of sermons are informed by it, a lot of preparings. But the two things, the pieces of it that I'm thinking of today are these two limiting equators, these things that we get stuck in. And family systems talks about two of these things. The first thing is that the first error it sort of points out is when people emphasize data rather than decisiveness. Data rather than decisiveness. Especially in the information age, family systems would say, you can always find out more information. The information pit is bottomless. We're linked to every other person in one way or another, and you can always find out more information. The question isn't whether you can find out more information. The question is whether you can do something with it. So family systems is more about gathering what you can, but moving on and making a decision. Now, once you hear me talk like that, you would know that that sounds like me. This is the thing I try to teach or preach often. So this is one of the limiting equators. That fits Luke 24, because in the story they're explaining the scriptures, and they can do the data of theology all day. But that is not where Jesus shows up. And how that fits Luke 24 is also with this second limiting thing here. The first one is that to get stuck, you emphasize data over decisiveness, if that's a limiting thing. The other thing that's limiting is the emphasis of empathy over responsibility. Empathy over responsibility. And the way that family systems talks about that is that you have to be careful when you're constantly trying to make sure that you know how everybody feels before you emphasize that everybody has a decision to make. When you do that, you're stuck in talking about what everybody's afraid of instead of what everybody feels good about. And so this is a family systems that there's always a feeling in this system, and it doesn't mean you don't listen to them or respect them, but it means that if you're not careful, you get worried about swapping out places, walking a mile in someone else's shoes, instead of understanding that you've been called to be a person who walks a mile in the shoes that you've been given by God. And why that's a problem is when you're always looking for what's wrong with people, you're going to find it, and you're going to get stuck in it, you're going to get bogged down in it. One of the ways that this plays out for me in real time is the snow policy that I try to enact here at St. Stephen. I do not believe in canceling worship because of snow. I'm not saying I would never do it, and I have canceled things, but I work to the best of my ability to never cancel something. I believe that you all are people who are able to choose responsibility over the fear of what happens when it snows. What happens when it snows is a reality. accidents happen. That is part of, but we've lived here, and instead of calling around and asking everybody, do you think we should close today? I choose to try to say, only come if you feel it's safe. So that's trying to not be limited by a constant pull of everybody's sort of what we're afraid of. And so that goes back to this family systems thing, that if you're not careful, you're stuck in data rather than decisiveness. And then if you're not careful, you go for empathy, trying to understand how everybody feels instead of responsibility. Both of these things are things that sort of can get a congregation, a hike, a disciple going from point A to point B would get bogged down. If you were on a hike and you tried to learn everything there is to learn about every plant that you passed, you would never get to where you're going. If you're on a hike and you tried to fix every broken limb or every little broken branch or every leaf that has fallen, you would never get to where you're supposed to get. So churches are called, disciples are called, to be on this path. And we can't emphasize data over decisiveness. We can't emphasize empathy over responsibility. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be these things. It just means eventually you gotta be who God called you to be. Can you walk a mile in someone else's shoes? Is it possible to literally be them? I would say that it is not. I would say that you can walk with somebody. You can be who God made you to be. You can be Cleopas with this disciple, and God can show up with you on the hike, but you can't literally become the other person. Kate Bush asks if only she could, she'd make a deal with God, and I'd get him to swap our places. Maybe that's an awareness that otherwise she's not able to do that. In the context of that song, I think a lot's going on there, but it's not something you can do. You can't swap out places. It's not possible. You can't be the other person. What you can be is a caring person who cares about the other person, but you can't become them, right? We can't swap out our places. We can't walk a mile in someone else's shoes. We can't know all the data there is to know. We can't account for every feeling that a thing makes happen. We can only occupy the space God gives us. We can only walk a mile in our shoes right next to the person in their shoes, holding their hand if we need to, or encouraging them, or taking a break with them when we need to, but not actually literally in their shoes. We can only make our sort of faithful attempt to be ourselves in connection with other people, and there's a way that works. We're in connection with them, but we can't be them. I'm sort of connected to the story of the road to Emmaus. I think the character of Cleopas speaks to me, but I'm never literally going to become Cleopas. But, I've had instances where I can feel a sort of connection there. To me, that's part of what's going on here in Luke 24. Cleopas never understands who Jesus is. The data, the trying to figure out how everybody feels doesn't solve it. It's only when that Cleopas chooses to be hospitable, will you join me for dinner, that the shoe drops and who God's presence is made. So I want you to think about this. Narrative criticism. What characters, when you hear a story, do you tend to identify with? And what role does that put you in terms of what God is saying to you? What do you think about these limiting things? Is it possible to get bogged down in data rather than being decisive? Do you agree with family systems on that? Is it possible to emphasize empathy over responsibility? And is that a problem or not? These are things that we think about when we approach a story like this. Maybe what you're thinking about is you're all the way back on that beginning. Is the Rock Hall really inducted the best ever musicians? One of the groups I thought deserved to get in didn't, and they got in before with this other group I like that did get in, that I thought maybe they would have to wait a little bit longer. So who knows what other people were thinking, and can you really even control that? Really, all you can control is who you are and how you feel about that, and that's a bit here of what I think the road to Emmaus is about, that Jesus shows up on our walk, and all we can do is be aware of where God loves us and be on that walk with other people. We can't walk in their shoes. We can't swap out places. But we can sort of be on the walk. Our shoes can walk next to the shoes, and God can show up when that's happening. To me, ultimately, Kate Bush may or may not really be the right choice, but she gets it right because she sets herself in the hands of God. In the way that she sings this song, if only I could, I'd make a deal with God, and I'd get him to swap our places. Sets herself into a perspective where she's trying to come to grips with what she's facing, running up that hill, a challenge, by setting it into, well, what would God have for me in this? And in that gets my interest. I agree with that. She keeps trying to run up that hill, and even if, she's been running up it for all these years, she's been running up it, and she's setting herself in the hands of God, and she's, sort of trying to learn or put into perspective what God might be doing or how God might be showing up. I think it is vital in Luke 24 that God shows up and the pivot happens when the hospitality, when the asking Jesus to stay for dinner, which is a simple thing and a thing you can do. You can't question what another person's diet is, but you can go out to eat with them and sort of model what a good diet looks like, right? So there's some stuff to sort of work through Luke 24 with again. This week I will talk specifically about that Jesus being found in the breaking of bread. This is sort of a part 2 of last week's introduction. I talked about the breaking of bread and how easy, simple, straightforward that is, and that's a godly thing at times. I'm going to take that a step further and say, if breaking of bread is a godly thing, how do we participate in breaking bread for our families, for ourselves, for our world? So there's some, I wouldn't call it theological stuff, I would call it narrative criticism information, some family systems information, which you can do with what you please. But hopefully it gets you to think about Luke 24, so that when we gather for worship, you feel like you're starting to almost know this story by heart. It's a story of walking in a post-resurrection world, and it provides the promise that God will show up in the midst of our journey. That the journey that God shows up in is our own. It's not about swapping out places, it's about walking with people well. And so that's what we'll think about this upcoming Sunday. And as usual, if you have any questions or ongoing things, Google ideas you've heard here, look into it, think critically, or get a hold of me and let me know what you're thinking. All right, that is preparing for Sunday, for May 14th. Happy Mother's Day weekend, and hopefully I'll see you this upcoming Sunday. Again, Luke 24, and hopefully we get to spend even more time together thinking about it. I hope that you stay safe and that I see you Sunday. Talk to you later.